We'll get started in a minute. Oh, the QR code. How do I do that? Unshare? Okay. Guys, scan the QR code. Everyone. It's malware. Yeah. Okay, everyone done? Okay. Okay. Okay, let's get started. Yeah, thanks for joining the OAUTH working group meeting. So as you have already seen, we have a little bit of hiccup with the data tracker. So I'm running this from the phone. Hopefully it works. Rifat, as you can see, is not here this time. He's joining us from remote with a little bit of a challenging time zone difference. We have a pretty full agenda, again, like all the other meetings before. So let's get started. Since this is the first meeting, I want to point out the note well, so behave civilized. I don't have any worry in this group, but check out the documents, the different PCPs on that topic, from the standards process all the way down to patents and copyright, etc., privacy policy. You already scanned the QR code, so I don't need to tell this. Yeah. Nothing to be said here. A shout out, maybe, where's Daniel? Go to the microphone, say a few words about the next OAuth security workshop in Reykjavik.
Yes, next OAuth security workshop will be in Reykjavik, February 26th to 28th, last week of February. It's going to be very cold. Please bring your winter clothes. And yeah, we selected Reykjavik because of Northern Lights mainly. Yeah. No, it will be great. It will be hosted by Signicat. And if you're interested to submit a talk, you can do that. As always, there's also an unconference part, so you don't have to submit your talk beforehand. We are also looking for sponsors if somebody wants to sponsor the event. We hope that we can open registration this month.
What's the deadline for submitting talks?
We have 2 deadlines. The last one is, I think, in January. Would have to look that up.
Okay. Okay, it's always been a great event, so encourage you to go there, present what you're working on. Quick update. So we're working on write-ups for 2 documents for the browser-based apps and also for the cross-device flow. I will be working with Peter. Where's Peter? Don't see him. Yep. This week on the write-up for the cross-device flow, and Rifat is working on the browser-based apps. We have 1 document in the RFC editor queue, the protected resources metadata. So that's moving along. Everything good so far, I would say. And with respect to the agenda, we have like 3 sessions, as we had for a number of times already. Today, we have the token status list, attestation-based client authentication, transaction tokens, and the client ID hint presentations. So without wasting too much time, let's jump to the first talk. Tobias Ball, who is here? Well, the remote Bastion is here. Okay, cool.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Yes. Yeah, I will do the presentation with Christian. Tobias is also on the line, but Christian, I will present.
Okay, go for it.
Okay.
I can also try to share.
Yeah, I think that worked easier the last time.
Okay.
If that's okay for you.
No, sure.
Thank you very much. Yes, and then, yes, this is the update to a token status list, formerly known as JOT status list. We'll present our updates, what happened since last time, the remaining discussion points that we have, question and answers, and then we'll have a look at the further roadmap for the standards. We're quite far, so we want to look where to go with this. Next slide, please. So as a refresher, the problem is that, compared to the identity provider model, where, for example, JOTs are issued on demand and also only like for one transaction, we now have the issue holder verifier model and other methods where we issue a token, for example, a JOT, and we want to communicate a status or convey that status before it expires. And therefore, we need some kind of revocation mechanism or more general a status mechanism. And therefore, we want to see how we can incorporate this into HOSE and COSE-based tokens. Next slide, please. Yeah, the key facts about token status list. It's a revocation or status mechanism quite similar to certificate revocation lists. It is a very scalable revocation method, better than CRL, but in general, it shares quite similar privacy properties. It's very simple to understand and it's very easy to implement. That's what we focused on in our design. And it is being used in other specs, or it is intended to be used. We have it in the verifiable credentials model for selective disclosure JOTs, and it is also planned to be used for the ISO 18013-5 amendment, which is the format that is being used for the mobile driving license or MDocs in general. It's also named by the ARF 1.4. That's the architecture reference framework. That's kind of the underlying technical ecosystem guideline for the eIDAS identity ecosystem in Europe. So it's named there as one of the possible status mechanisms. We've tested this in various interop events and hackathons. So we have a number of implementations of this, and we have quite a lot of experience now. And I know also, like from Internet Identity Workshop last week, several people told me that they've used that, and I actually didn't know that before. So it's kind of spreading right now across some use cases. That's very nice to see. And also we've established an extension point so that we have the status claim, which can also be used by other status mechanisms. So this is not only focused at the status list will be the only status mechanism, and we provide an IANA registry where other status mechanisms could also register. Next slide, please. The big picture, as a reminder here, we have the issuer holder and the verifier. We call it relying party here in OAuth terms. And in our terminology, we have the reference token, which is the token, credential, access token, whatever it is, where we want to convey a status about. The issuer issues a reference token to the holder. He presents that one to the relying party. And the issuer may update the status of this reference token, convey this to the status issuer. The status issuer would be the one that issues this status list, and he might provide this then to the status provider, who is the one that serves the status list on a public endpoint, and the relying party may fetch this status list then from the status provider. We kind of split up this role here on the left side. In most scenarios, the issuer, status list issuer, and status provider may be the same, but there are scenarios where these roles may be split up. So we made the split up in the draft. And in the other picture, we see the reference token. This is usually HOSE or COSE secured. It contains a reference to the status list. the status list is in JSON or CBOR and describes the status of the reference token. And the status list object may then be embedded in a status list token, which is a JOT or a COT. And the reference token may be anything, SD JOT, VC, ISO MDOC, access tokens, whatever it is you want to convey the status about. Next slide, please. A short reminder here how the mechanism works. We have the reference token and the example, a JSON Web Token. We have the Jose header and the JOT payload. There may be any other claims about credentials or access tokens. The important thing is we have the status parameter, which is also the extension point for other mechanisms. Within this object, we define the status list claim. And within this status list claim, we have the URI and the index. The URI points to the public endpoint where the status list is hosted, and the index to which particular point within a byte array the index is conveyed. And on the next slide, we will see then how the status list looks. This is again the one in the JSON Web Token format. We again have a Jose header and a payload. The important part here is the status list claim, which contains two members. The first one is the bits. This communicates how many bits per one status for one reference token is conveyed. In this example, we have 1. So the values can be 0 or 1, meaning valid or invalid. You could also communicate more than one bit of status if you're, for example, interested to distinguish between valid, suspended, and revoked. Also, you could also communicate more than just valid and invalid. And then we have the list, which is in this case the base 64 encoded compressed byte array. And on the next slide, we will see how the reference token and the status list are fitting together. In the first picture, we have the status claim from the reference token. The URI points to the status list, which also matches the sub value. And then the status list, we base 64 decode, deflate the compressed data. Then we get the byte array. And within this byte array, we look up the index 5. And then we say here we get a 1 in this example, which means invalid. And we provide a registry where these status types are conveyed and what they mean. So that's the basic mechanism. On the next slide, we see the changes. We made a lot of changes recently. We've cut down many issues. We made 2 new updates, version 4 and 5. So version 5 is the most up to date. And I think on the next slide, we will see the recent changes for version 4. I don't want to read them out all. We had a lot on privacy considerations, implementation considerations, security considerations. Also worth to note that we have a working example for the mobile driving license, and this kind of matches what they intend to do in the amendment for the -5 standard. We have a lot of fixes, smaller issues, and improvements. And on the next slide, we have the changes for the version 5. One of the bigger things is here that we added support, a new feature for historical requests. That will be on the next slide, and some other more minor issues, improvements on the text, the terminology. We removed the constraint that a status list token must not use a MAC. We thought that might be useful for access tokens, where it may be easier to share a symmetric key. So this is one of the changes, but the biggest one since last time is probably the new feature on historical requests. That's on the next slide. We were approached that for certain scenarios, it might be interesting to get a status list and what it was like a certain time ago, that may be relevant and regulatory use cases to get this information. We were a little bit reluctant to do this for privacy reasons. So it's important that this is an optional feature, and we have a huge text in the privacy section that you should be aware that it means what it means if you integrate this. Because it may reveal the behavior of the reference token over the time in the past. But we decided to integrate it with an optional feature, and what it does is that we add a query parameter time, and then you can provide a unique timestamp, and then basically you will just get back the status list token, how it was like for this specific point of time, and that may be helpful for some more niche use cases. But as I said, it's optional for the implementer of the status provider or the status issuer to do this. Yes, and then on the next slide, the remaining issues, and with that, I will hand over to Christian.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well. So for remaining issues, good news, we closed tons of issues in the past few months. And like a lot of the issues that are remaining are editorial. So we need to do quite a bit of editorial work. We have 4 bigger open questions that we would like to discuss today. And the first one on the next slide would be the support for the unsigned option. So right now we have basically 4 options for a status list. It can be JSON Web Token, CBOR Web Token, or unsigned JSON and unsigned CBOR. We brought this up, I think, the past 2 IETF meetings as well. We had a longer discussion with Brian. He was the one who proposed to keep the unsigned option. After that discussion with Brian, we kind of understand where it's coming from. The problem is that keeping JSON and CBOR directly creates a lot of complexity, especially in the spec. Like, it makes it a lot harder to read and write. We had discussions last week at IAW, and we are leaning towards the option of removing the unsigned option. It makes the spec a lot cleaner and easier to implement. And for the use cases that are closer to where you would be using the unsigned option, we are also kind of thinking perhaps HMacking might make more sense. And then it makes the spec and implementations a lot easier.
Christian, when you say we, what does we refer to? Who is we?
So
like we decided, we think.
So these were discussions that Paul, Tobias, and I had with some of the people that brought this topic up. Like this is a rather big change. That is why we wanted to have a discussion today on this. But from what like the spec looks right now, it would become quite a bit easier if we remove JSON and CBOR support directly and only have tokens, basically.
To only have signed tokens.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's ask the question.
So are there any opinions on this?
Yeah. So the question to the room is, are you upset if we, or do some of your use cases go away if we remove the possibility for unsigned JWTs or CWTs?
Yeah, to be clear, the unsigned option is just plain JSON and CBOR. So we're basically just saying that it would always have to be a JWT or CWT with a permitted and valid algorithm securing the status list.
Right. You would have to rely on, let's say, transport layer security to do the protection for you.
Yes.
That's correct.
So I don't see what Justin. Okay, Justin comes to the microphone.
Hi, Justin Richer. Architecturally, it's cleaner to separate the content from the delivery format. There are other methods that could be used to secure it. However, if in practical terms, people are always using this inside of a Jose Cozy style container, there's not really a compelling argument to keep that separation just because it's a possible abstraction layer. It's abstraction from zero, which is pretty much never a good idea. So I'm also not really planning on using this. So take my opinion for what it's worth there. That said, I think it's probably fine to drop it, but I would encourage the editors to add a lengthy security considerations discussion about the fact that this is designed around the assumption that it will always be in a secured container of some type. And because the assumptions that go into the design of the content, then that tends to leak across the layer, right? Like we don't have really unsigned JOTs, at least not in good secure systems. Yeah, I know, I heard the snickering. Because the assumptions are that this would always be inside some type of cryptographically protected container. It took us a while as a community to actually go write that down. So if we're going to drop that, please make sure we do that there.
Yep. So I see Aaron. Where's Aaron? Okay.
Hi, Aaron Parecki. My use case for this does not require the signed JOT option, just fetching the document. That said, I don't have any plans to do this at the moment in any sort of in the near future. So again, take that for what it's worth. But just I don't know if there's a way to leave open the possibility of extending it later that can sort of add it back in if someone does have that use case. But yeah.
Well, you can always do that with specifications. You can always change them.
Yep.
Okay. Brian, go for it.
Brian Campbell, since I was named earlier, I just want to maybe clarify that a lot of my suggestion originally to keep the unsigned option was actually really an attempt at simplification to only have the unsigned option, which I still think is actually the right thing to do, but I will concede that there are quote unquote use cases for signed options. So acknowledging that, it's probably better to go ahead and just move towards simplification the other direction and drop the unsigned option. If we need to support the signed, then having 2 options rather than 4 is probably preferable. So I see Christian nodding. Thank you.
So I at least from the room, I sense like there's no strong objection. Of course, we have to confirm that, or we post anything on a mailing list as part of the meeting minutes anyway, so we'll confirm that on the list, but at least I don't hear anyone screaming. The other question like I had already from the beginning was like, you had this JWD and CWD, like that's sort of chair head off, and like those 2 options, like, do you really need to have 2 different options there too, since you are in the already in the mode of thinking like, oh, couldn't we just make things a little bit simpler? I'm sure you've heard that question before.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think people are looking to use this in different ecosystem, and there are ecosystems that are based on CBOR, like MDL, and then there are ecosystems like SDJOT based ones or access tokens. And the question is, do you really want to pull in like the dependencies of like of the opposite into your programs if you could just use what you already have as dependencies. So MDL probably doesn't want to do JSON Web Token when they have everything in CBOR, and on the opposite, a lot in OpenID with SDJOT maybe don't want to pull in the CBOR dependency only for the revocation mechanism when everything else is being done with JSON. So that's a problem that we have.
Okay. Yeah, I think just to add to that, the nature of the implementations today is like, for example, the MDoc MDL ecosystem almost exclusively uses CBOR as a data representation technology and COSE as providing signature and cipher representations. And so adding in Jose is perceived as quite a big lift, and the same as for SDJOT.
Then I would say let's go to the next discussion point, if you don't mind.
Brian wants to have one short comment.
Oh.
One short comment kind of begs the question why ISO and MDL don't just define their own mechanisms as opposed to relying on a very adjacently related standards organization here.
But that's sort of like we can't answer that question.
Well,
I think to answer that though, ISO already do have dependencies on IETF documents. They use COSE in a lot of IETF documents as the basis for MDocs. So yeah, there is a choice about them using that, but naturally the solution they would end up with is very similar to this.
But I don't think we should second guess what they like, unless Tobias or Christian or someone else in the room is actually participating in ISO and the standardization work. I don't think we should answer the question for them on why they do what they do.
Well, I'm more asking the other question, why we're developing standards here specifically for that one particular narrow slice of MDL. Yes, they do COSE sign, they don't do any ciphers, and they use CBOR. But typically in this working group, we've defined Jose, JWT style specifications. So this is one kind of narrow bit that we're doing in this working group.
So
geared at support of MDL, which it's a little bit odd.
I understood the response previously to that question in the sense that like that is one use case, and there may be others who happen to use COSE and CBOR. But of course, if that's the only one, that's a different question then, or a different consideration. But Joseph, so now I don't have Rifat with me to keep track of the time, which is I'm lost, but hopefully we don't blow right out the...
I'll maybe take a quick crack at answering Brian's question. I mean, I think there's a lot of developers that are going to have to implement across both ISO, MDL and SDJOT. It really keeps things simpler if we don't have the ISO people defining their own thing that overlaps with the IETF thing. If we can keep them a little bit aligned, it really helps make everyone's life a lot simpler.
Maybe it's also a task for the chairs to actually reach out to some of the ISO, or we don't want to do that? Okay, all right.
I don't disagree with that, but there's already an entire fork of things that are completely different. So it's a little bit awkward just from a structure and architectural perspective that this one little thing is kind of coming back here. But I concede we're going to keep it. It's very odd.
Okay, we'll think about this a little bit more. Okay.
I did want to just say I don't think it's
think about it. Okay, good.
I don't think it's a little
won't think about it. So just you didn't hear that, Tobias, but yeah.
I just wanted to say I don't think it's a little, like, I think a lot of the conversation is around mobile driving licenses. The reality is MDocs is just as general purpose as a credential format as, say, SDJWT. They're being applied to many adjacent ecosystems around the world, not just for driving licenses. And so standardizing that, and to the points that Joseph made before, developers are going to be running into both of these credential format technologies. And so how status is expressed across them, to the extent that we can keep that homogeneous through a singular draft, I think is beneficial.
Okay, let's jump to the next issue. So we don't get... Oh, Tony, you have... Oh, I almost failed to notice you.
Tony Nadlin. We did look at using other things for status lists, but the work that Tobias and others were doing, it just seemed natural to wind up using the status list instead of over in ISO inventing our own again. So, and I mean, it's just the use of CBOR here, so it's better than inventing a whole new status list thing over in ISO than just getting the CBOR Act part here. So that was our decision, whether it's right or wrong, but we needed something, to use. And let's just take advantage of the work over here instead of reinventing it over in ISO. Yes. I speak on behalf of 8013-5, which we are working on. Okay.
Okay. Good.
Next slide, please.
Next slide.
Yes, so compression algorithms. I remember this was one of the first feedbacks we got like a year ago. We are contemplating to introduce a currently optional parameter to allow the definition of the compression algorithm. We also got some feedback that people would like to use this thing without any compression. Because if you're using HTTP everywhere, the compression would be happening over transport anyway. So we are debating whether it makes sense or not to add this additional parameter or claim for compression. And it might actually also be very beneficial in the long run if we want to do something like zero knowledge proofs over revocation status. Because decompressing in a ZK circuit is super complex, like you don't want to do that. But it might be a bit premature to optimize for things like zero knowledge. So the question would be, do we add a registry or do we reuse a registry? There is, for example, the HTTP compression message registry. And in general, are people in favor of adding this as a parameter, like a configuration parameter, basically? And perhaps like Paul explained before, we are compressing the byte array, right? The statuses.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the HTTP compression would compress your status list, but I might be wrong here. I need to double check. I remember HTTP compression for the headers, but not for the.
No, what we meant, sorry.
Mhm.
Oh, I think he's
Is-
probably about to explain what I was about to explain. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. It was reusing the identifiers rather than inventing a registry to
Right.
annotate them. And
Okay.
we said that knowing full well tying yourself to a registry that is for a different purpose,
Okay.
you know, can diverge in its meaning dramatically and create issues. But we were, I guess, in pursuit of maybe using identifiers that had already been standardized without having to invent a new registry.
Right. So Justin Richard, to add to that, it is perfectly okay for a new RFC to update the content and structure of an existing IANA registry, add new columns that say this is okay for this purpose or what have you. That all has to be approved by whoever is watching over the existing registry, which importantly invites the kind of conversation we would want to have for how that registry gets used going forward. Also to add, I know that there are a handful of general purpose crypto, et cetera, related registries floating around. There's like a hash algorithms registry and stuff like that. So I strongly recommend that if we go in this registry direction, we try to reuse one instead of inventing one for this purpose, because there are too many of these out there already, and it's confusing, and they tend to pick slightly different code points.
Yeah, the question is, like, it interestingly relates to the earlier debate where we wanted to reduce the number of options, but one slide later we are adding options, different, like if there's a better compression algorithms, then maybe we should use it, and rather than having the options of, oh, you pick your own, because then the question will soon arrive is like, how do the different entities figure out what the configuration settings are? And maybe you are going to get there in the next slide. I should have looked at the slide beforehand, but but that would be unfair.
Following up to what Hannah said, like before, we're not going to rely on HTTP level security mechanisms, but now we really want to rely on HTTP level compression mechanisms. Seems a little bit disjoint. As far as ZKP proofs, I don't know how that stuff works. I may never know, but I'm almost positive you won't reuse this status list construct in that. So trying to build out optimizations for extensibility to support that into this structure, it seems like a really bad idea. And I don't know, maybe make it configurable, parameterized, but it doesn't really seem worth it, particularly when you already have the construct of making this whole list and status mechanism extensible in another layer. So if, I don't know, if somebody really needs uncompressed or zlib version 7, I don't even know what other algorithms out there, they can already do that by plugging in a different mechanism. This feels like an unnecessary potential optimization at this point, while there's not even extensibility point, while there's already other extensibility points. And back to Hannes's point, less options usually are better if you, to the point where it makes sense, which it doesn't always, but I'm talking. Don't do it.
Big Q, Paul.
Yeah, I think maybe to emphasize the significance of compression, like the whole idea about the status list is that compression is really important, because if compared to the CRL, we don't only include the revoked identifiers, but like we include like the status of like every issued credential, and that only works because then you have like a huge range of zeros and only a few ones. That's why it compresses so well, and is in the end smaller than the CRL, although we include everyone. So compression is quite important. And if people fuck up their HTTP configuration, then the status lists will just be quite huge. And the other idea here was that potentially zero knowledge proofs have a hard time to do decompression. So the idea was here to not have compression as an option. So it's not so much about other compression algorithms, but more of like having none as a revocation compression. And then on the other hand, I totally understand we probably don't see the whole picture for zero knowledge proofs, so it might be a premature optimization. And I think it's better to not have additional options here. That's my point.
But Paul, that doesn't sound like, it sounds very contradictory. You want to add the option to not have compression, while compression is so important for this purpose.
I would say always do compression with zlib, no options.
Okay, so actually, so it's, but someone says that they don't want to have compression. Okay, good. Dick.
I haven't heard anyone that says they don't really want a compression. They just think that maybe why compress if it's already going to get pressed at the HTTP level. But let's minimize the optionality that we have on something like this to make it easier to implement and get adopted. The more options you have, if it supposedly pleases everybody, then it pleases nobody. If you're going to do anything, then make it that you have to have support for zlib, and that you'd have to be able to serve it over zlib, so that the consumer would always know that it's going to always work a particular way, that there's a way that it will for sure work. Would be the only thing if you think that you might even want to do something like this.
Okay, this Justin. Okay, no Justin. Philip.
Philip Skokan, hi. If you already have so many zeros and then a couple ones in there, is the change from zlib to anything else going to make a difference? Probably not. So I wouldn't make it an option at all.
Okay, so question to the whole room. Is anyone in favor of allowing options, different options for alternative compression algorithms? Like in the room, raise your hand. And I don't know if someone is watching the chat. Is someone watching the chat here? Mike, are you following the chat?
I do.
Okay, so post in the chat if you really want to have options for compression algorithms. I don't see anyone in the room being in favor of that. So it looks like to be confirmed on a mailing list that there's not a strong interest in having those options for compression algorithms. So stick with what you have, and that's good. Okay.
Perfect. Then next slide, please.
Good.
The last question for today, content type. So right now the spec uses accept header and content type headers to basically be able to ask for a specific type of status list, for example, JOT or CWT, and to identify the response. There are systems out there, especially some CDNs, that do not support proper content type. So we got some discussions on this. Right now in the spec, it is a must. So the spec requires you to properly answer with the right content type, which would break usability of this thing for some deployments, I guess. So the question is, option one is we leave things as is. We say, hey, content type is an important thing for the web, and you should support it. Option two would be we relax from must to a should, and allow certain ecosystems to basically define what to expect out of band. So it could be done via like extending the URL with a .jot or .twt and so on. It might make things a bit more complicated, and like we got feedback from both parties, I would say. So yeah, is there any feedback on this in the room?
Daniel is in the queue.
Yeah, as I said before, if they cannot send the correct content type, that's a them problem. So yeah, I would try to enforce it.
Yeah, because I think I'm with Daniel here. Like many HTTP specifications or many protocols that run over HTTP assume that this works. Like if it now doesn't work for us and works everywhere else, that would be a real problem. And like what's like besides Daniel, any other views? Tobias.
Yeah, I guess the thing that just gave us pause, and this is probably just down to historical references, we noticed a few, I guess, RFCs in this space that don't go so far as to normatively define the content type. They'll say, you know, the endpoint response here is a JSON document, but it won't say that the content type must be application JSON. And I wondered whether or not that was just purposefully being flexible or unintentionally. And you know, I tend to agree with Daniel Fett that if we don't see a reason not to do that, we would really like to use this as a reliable signal. It just got raised from some forums, and I guess when we looked at some RFCs, we thought it might have been neglected on purpose, but we couldn't find any evidence of why that would be the case.
There are documents written by the HTTP group about how to use HTTP as a substrate, and they provide some guidance. I need to look up the exact RFC references and I think they discussed this topic. Kathleen, you may.
We have a PR on this that is proposing a should, and we are kind of using the same language HTTP uses right now. So if you're not able to get it from header, basically do a best effort trial. But yeah, we are not really sure if that's a good idea.
Kathleen Moriarty, I'm not able to sign in, right? Because data tracker's down. So.
Yep.
All right. So Kathleen Moriarty, my suggestion would be, since you have found the problem in prior RFCs, if you're able to search through, create a list of those, and then raise the problem, there could be a way to get that addressed so that people do send the right thing and that they include the content type. That way developers out there are informed. It might be that, you know, you go to all dispatch with this, and then there could be errata entered, or it could be a biz document to make those corrections. But it would help developers out there to just fix the problem. It's my 2 cents as a somewhat active IETF person.
Yeah, we can also use the IETF meeting like as or share to talk to some of the HTTP folks and get their feedback on what the current recommendations are, and point you to those. I'm sure they are documented somewhere. This is not a new feature in HTTP, so that's a pity. Yeah, if we speak louder, they probably hear us. Yeah. Oh, I asked him. Go for it.
Yeah, Cart. I'm new into all of this, so don't know the history, but in the reference in the token that's pointing to the list, what about having it say what the content type of the response is going to be, right? Like, I mean, if it's in a MDoc and then they're going to want to be in CWT or something like that, that you can say, well, this is how it is, right? That it is only in one type as opposed to the caller being able to say, hey, I want in this type, and then the list manager having to go and support all the different kinds of lists. You could just say, it's going to be in this format, and that people using that type of token are going to expect it to be in that format,
Yeah.
which just simplifies the whole thing and removes optionality about what you have to respond in.
Yeah, what is the expected sort of interaction or typical deployment? Is it that the server presenting the status lists, will it return the format that basically, depending on what you ask for, you ask for one format one day and you ask for the next format the other day, or will it always be based on the client? Some clients always only get the data in a specific format.
Sorry, I'll just jump in there and maybe try and answer that. So yeah, generally it'll operate the way that Dick says, right? Which is that if you've got an SDJOT ecosystem and you've got SDJOT based credentials, the implementer that issued those tokens is also the status list issuer and is going to use probably JOTs for its status mechanism. And we don't want to go so far as to mandate a JOT-based reference token can't use a CWT-based status list, but we would say that that will be rare, that you will cross the kind of format representations, right? And we kind of wanted to leave it to ecosystems to profile that usage and say that, SDJOT for most SDJOT deployments will use JOT-based status list representations, and MDocs will always use CWT. And that's why the content type becomes less meaningful, because if you have that context as your implementation is doing this HTTP request, it's kind of got a pseudo inferred content type of the response.
Justin Richer. So this is an HTTP based protocol, right? Question to the
Yep.
vendors. Okay. Well, then let's use HTTP. All right. HTTP already has content negotiation and content type marking. This needs to be a must. It should just work the way that HTTP is supposed to work. Having authored a number of RFCs at this point, I can almost guarantee you that the places where it doesn't specify the content type is probably laziness on the part of the author, because I'm pretty sure I've done that a bunch. And in this case, since we expect to have ecosystems that talk about these different content types, then yes, it absolutely should be specified. I also think that we should allow for the accept header on request to this, so that a client can negotiate if it really wants to. I do also think that the reality is that there are going to be lots of extraordinarily dumb clients who just make an HTTP request, ignore all of the headers, and try to parse it, and then fail if it's not the one format that they were configured to work with. That's going to happen. That's just how the web works. But the web works okay that way, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't have all of the guardrails in place for the systems that want to do the dynamic negotiation, especially when we don't have to invent it. It's already there. We can just literally use it the way that it already is, the way that it's already specified. We're not even doing anything weird about this. There is a representation, which is the underlying data model. This is all weird HTTP terms, right? So there's the representation of the underlying data model, which is this object that is independent of JOT or CWT, and then there is the content, which is the encoded version of that with these content types, right? So I could very easily imagine a system that has the status list in some internal data structure, and only when somebody asks, it makes the JOT or it makes the CWT, and it just spits it out. A lot of systems probably won't do that, but there's no reason that they couldn't, right? And so all of that, I think, should be specified. And I think that getting all of that out of this specification, trying to invent things like putting it inside the token or doing it out of band or always assuming or something like that, codifying any of those anti-patterns, I think is going to be problematic. Admitting that those anti-patterns exist and sort of designing the guardrails around that, that's how the messy internet functions today. So let's just do that. And this is an easy question to me.
Okay. I see a couple of people nodding while Justin was speaking. So I think that's, I think there's good support in doing what Justin just said, from my sense of the room. Good. I think I'm still cannot connect to the data tracker. I don't know what the schedule was. 5 minutes behind. Okay. So I guess we have, how many more slides do we have on this one?
It's just the last slide. Next slide is last slide.
Let me get to that. Okay, wrap it
So,
up.
as said before, I think we got pretty far in the past few months. We have these 3 bigger issues, and I think we got good consensus on them now today. We will confirm on the mailing list. We will need another editorial pass, but we think we are pretty close to getting to working group last call, and we would like to start it before next IETF if possible. So the question would be, how do we proceed there? Should we have like an interims call, or what is the best way forward?
Do you want to have the interim meeting before the end of the year, like in early December, or do you mean after starting the working group last call to discuss the working group last call feedback, like beginning of the new year? Well, we can do an interim meeting, no problem. But just let us know what you think would be reasonable, like when you can actually address some of the issues we discussed today and so on and so on.
So I think our plan would be to get things done until early December. So if people are still available, it might make sense to have an interims call there and then start working group last call if possible.
Okay. Yeah, we'll find a time slot, send it around beginning of December. Hope many of you can join and provide some feedback, and we wrap this up and get it done. Excellent. I think you guys are up for the next presentation as well, according to my notes.
Yes, yes.
Let me switch the slides.
And the next presentation is also a lot shorter than this one. So we kind of expected to have more time on status list and less time on attestation-based standards indication. So let's start. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the general motivation didn't change. For the classical or security model, we require client authentication through backend channel, which is a bit problematic for the kind of use cases where you have like a 3-party model like OpenID for VCI, where this would create privacy challenges. So the motivation of the spec is to establish a mechanism for backend attested client authentication through a front-end channel. So the idea behind this would be that it gives an AS certain assurances about the security level or in general about a client. Next slide, please. So we've also shown the past few IETFs. The overall concept would be that the client currently generates an attestation key, so a key that the attestation will be bound to. Then we have 2 steps, 3 steps that are currently basically out of bound for this spec, which is we are requesting a client attestation by some kind of client backend. We generate the client attestation at the backend, we get it back with the binding to the generated key. And then we have, so when we arrive at the AS at the point, we generate a proof of possession with the key over a nonce, and we have a client attestation and a proof of possession for authentication. So that avoids the client instance to have to register with the AS via things like dynamic client registration, but it could still be used in conjunction with DCR. Next slide, please. So for this draft, there weren't that many changes since last IETF. We only cut 1 version as well. Next slide, please. So these are the changes that we did. The biggest one, I would say, was that we removed key attestation from the examples, but more on that in the next one. And we had like a bigger restructure of the draft to improve readability. And then Paul for the next parts, please.
Yeah, so there was a rather large discussion on where to proceed with this, because in the past, this draft tried to achieve 2 things at the same time, and that was somehow criticized by some people, and we learned a lot also from the OpenID for VC ecosystem. The two things were that we tried to authenticate the client and at the same time get some information on the keys that are being used there, and to reuse this knowledge about these keys or these attestations so that we could use some of those keys later on for certain things, for example, the key binding of verifiable credentials, so that the issuer would know how secure these keys are. After a lot of discussion over the summer, we kind of came to the agreement that it's better to split those two things up. We think that the client attestation should be more about establishing the trust in the client, and the key attestation should be something separate that gives assurances and trust about a key that's being used. That doesn't mean that key attestations could be used additionally within client attestations, but we think it makes sense to split these up, and this draft should only talk about client attestation. So therefore we removed these parts in the spec that try to account for this. We had some of the parts from key attestations that are currently moved into the OpenID for VCI spec. Ideally, in my belief, it would be a good idea to have the key attestation as a standalone draft, maybe at IETF, so that it could be used for other purposes as well than OpenID for VCI, but for some timing reasons, because we need to get finished with some of these standards for the eIDAS ecosystem, we decided to move the key attestations into the OpenID for VCI. That will also mean that this draft has has less responsibilities that it needs to fulfill. So we think that we can proceed faster on this draft, which is also positive. Next slide. The second discussion was on a nonce mechanism. We have defined several mechanisms how we can detect replay attacks. That could be an out-of-band method, or we could have the JTI approach that is also described there. We also name the approach of using a specific nonce provided by the authorization server, but we haven't defined yet the details of this. We also expect to make some significant progress here within the next weeks, because we had the very same discussion in the OpenID for VCI group. We reviewed the mechanisms that were used in DPOP and their shortcomings. And we, after long discussions, added a so-called nonce endpoint to the OpenID for VCI spec, and we can leverage these learnings to define how a nonce mechanism should be used for client attestation in this draft. The ideas here are that we will probably use nonces provided by headers, as we have a header-based syntax, and this is also kind of similar to what Depop does. If things are, if the nonce is not the right one, it's too old, we may throw a 400 with bad request, providing a new nonce. So Depop also does that. But on top of this, we want a mechanism to let the client ask for a specific nonce, or to just say, hey, I want a new nonce. That is something that Depop cannot provide, and it is a kind of a pain for implementations in OpenID, and also led to the design of the nonce endpoint in OpenID for VCI. So we'll leverage the learnings here. Yeah, that is it on the nonce fetching. And on the next slide, the third thing that we have scheduled is the Depop optimization. That was also something that we had figured out at the last IETF, but hadn't time to include this yet because we had to make some other changes before this. The idea here is that we have two headers, one for the attestation itself and one for the proof of possession. Now, if we use this, for example, at the token endpoint, there might be a good optimization because we will use Depop anyway. So we will make a proof of possession here so that we could make the proof of possession with the Depop header, and it may use the same key that we use for client attestation. And that, yeah, may save the client to do, another signing operation, which may be costly depending on where your key resides. So these are the three things that we have planned for client attestation. Is there any feedback or questions on this?
So on the nonce issue, so that's what you, is that what you did already, or what? So because there's no obvious, like it doesn't, it's just thoughts. It's not something you say, okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to go for this. It's kind of more still in the middle of being worked out.
Yes, we don't have a concrete proposal yet. As the nonce endpoint was worked out, I think only 2 weeks ago in OpenID for VCI. But I think we kind of have the direction in mind that we want to take here. George asked the question, is there a reason we can't define a common nonce solution instead of working around this in multiple specs? It's a good question. It was a proposal for so-called nonce endpoint, I think, in this working group 1 or 2 events before, and that was not accepted.
Well, it was not clear whether it would be used. At that time, you didn't need it, so it's of course we can work on, if it makes sense, we can work on it.
Yeah,
it's up to the group. George.
Sure. I'll just say that it seems like we're leveraging nonce a lot to address, the sort of time aspects or the freshness to some extent of, these cryptographic signed things, and potentially having a generic way to do this would simplify a lot of stuff, as opposed to every time we come along and we tweak it a little bit, right? And so I do think it adds, some cognitive complexity.
Christian.
I agree that this is or seems to be a recurring issue, but there are also, let's say, different optimizations. The Depop model, for example, assumes that generating a signature isn't that costly, right? Because you can just get a new nonce back via the error, so you would be signing twice. Whereas other use cases, and we saw that in the discussions in OpenID for VCI, assume that signing is costly. So there are different things to optimize for depending on context and like problem. So the question is, can we design a system that could work for both problems, basically, or consider them both?
Joseph.
Yeah, so I think the problem with a single nonce point is it forces us to have the same semantics for all the nonces, and I don't think we've documented those semantics clearly, and you could easily end up in a mess. So yeah, making clear semantics and defining an endpoint, and if that happens to be useful for other people, then sure, but I don't think we should go as far as saying this is the one way you should do nonces across everything in the OAuth working group.
Yeah. And we are not going to change Depop to just have a different endpoint for the nonces. That's something like that was in the past. So we can only apply the system we are developing in the future, right? So, Peter.
Just addressing a comment about the assumptions about signing being expensive or not in Depop. The assumption in Depop is not that it is not expensive, but that there is a risk decision that an implementer may make, and therefore is willing to pay the price of making the extra signature, right? So it's not an assumption that signing is not expensive. It is more, in some cases, you will need this freshness guarantee, and then you have the nonce. And maybe that's another way to look at it, is it's an optional risk mitigation mechanism that you deploy.
Yeah. There's also the issue of like who creates that signature. In Depop, it may be just some software, while in this case for attestation, we are talking about some very low level functionality, potentially a secure element. So it could be, it's like, it won't be lightning fast. But Justin. Okay.
So, Justin Richer, I will repeat again what I said the last time that we discussed the whole nonce endpoint. One of the most important thing about a nonce is that it exists in a context, and having a generic nonce endpoint that says, here's a random number, go run with it, divorces it from that context. And so this sort of piggybacks a bit on what Joseph was saying a second ago, in that we have a lot of different contexts in which we're trying to use a nonce, and a lot of different spaces where this is coming from. If this really was just, we need a random number sent to us, then we should all just call random.org and call it a day, and not try to invent anything. They have an API. I mean, why not just use theirs, right? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about using it in context of a specific protocol, a specific cryptographic carrier mechanism, a specific exchange and ongoing negotiation between different parties for particular purposes. And in each of those cases, yes, we're reinventing nonce carriers, but we're reinventing them in the scope and in the context of the places where we're actually using them. And it's that context that gives the nonce value. I would much rather we stop reinventing intent registration here in OAuth, but that's a whole separate conversation. So, you know, this may very well be the case where we just keep building different special purpose wheels for different things, because, you know, car wheels and train wheels and wagon wheels are all wheels, but they all do very different things because they exist in different contexts.
Nicely said, Justin. Yeah. And also, actually, the first line indicates on the slide indicates that, because here we use nonce over JTI, because JTI is something that is for the low level, like for a secure element, is something, a timestamp. This is absolute time in a JTI. It's not available to some of those secure elements. That's why we are using a nonce here. Otherwise, we could sort of shortcut the whole discussion. But that makes it also different to Depop, and that's why different context. So okay, cool. Thanks, Justin. Good. Okay, so it sounds like we need we need to work more on this. It's not done yet. So I wonder whether this is these two documents actually, because they seem to be needed by the same audience, the same community, whether we put not just the previously discussed draft but also this one onto the interim meeting, the status list, and also this one. What would you think? Why is that would we overload the interim meeting? It would be nice to make some progress on this as well.
Yeah, I think it's not a bad idea, because the audience is, as you said, quite the same. I think with status list, we are a bit more ready than with client attestation. But I think, yeah, if we have the interims call anyway, then it could make sense to address both.
Okay, good. Okay, yep. Someone jumped onto the queue and then left immediately. Okay, so do you have some further slides on this? Like, what are the next steps? Questions? No. Next steps, presumably you need to work on those open issues.
Yes, exactly. Work on these three issues as we outlined how we want to proceed with those. But I think it will take a little bit more time than a status list. I think with status list, we're more clear that we're reaching the end, and we're closer to the working group last call than with client attestation.
Yeah, it's also a more complicated topic, so I guess it's fine. Cool, thanks. Who's going to talk about the transaction tokens? Peter, George, are you going?
That's me.
Okay.
And my apologies for quickly gathered slides. So we'll go through. I dropped unintentionally the introductory slide. But I will attempt to describe what transaction tokens are, and then we'll talk about what's been happening. I want to spend most of the time on a couple of discussions. I think last time we ended up spending most of the time talking about changes. So that's kind of the way this is going to go. You can skip ahead 2 slides. There's I don't have a Dublin picture, so there's the ubiquitous previous IETF Vancouver slide.
Very clever, George. So you, like Brian.
Yeah. Learning from the best, right? So before we get into the merge PRs, for a quick overview of transaction tokens, we're really the goal of transaction tokens is to look at transactions within a multi-workload environment as a whole, as opposed to treating them as a series of independent API invocations between multiple workloads. So if to complete a transaction, I need to talk to 4 different downstream workloads. In most cases today, that amounts to workload 1 calling workload 2, often with mutual authentication of some ilk, right? And then workload 2 calls workload 3, etc. But there's no continuity across those as to the purpose of the transactions, which often leaves critical aspects of API invocations open to change. So if one of your intermediate workloads is compromised, then effectively they can change the structure of the API requests and effectively muck the transaction. So transaction tokens give you a way of defining a context at the beginning of a transaction, and then carrying that context throughout the entire lifetime of the transaction, making critical elements immutable and carrying additional context. So starting to effectively have an identifier for a transaction and what are all the workloads it went through becomes really useful from a sort of an audit security perspective. So my apologies for forgetting to add the architecture slide. I will just also call out that in the architecture we have an object or an entity that we call the transaction token service, which is the issuer of transaction tokens, and this will come up in the discussion topic. So I wanted to call that out, that a little bit like in the status list, the issuer may be the status list provider, but they're 2 separate conceptual entities. It's there's similar things here in transaction tokens between, let's say, maybe an API gateway and the transaction token service. Okay, so we have done a bunch of PRs. They're relatively small. I won't go through all of these in detail. I think I have a summary slide coming up that talks about these, but just to say that we've been working on this, addressing a lot of the feedback. Actually, go to the next slide, Hannes. And addressing a lot of the feedback from the last IETF in Vancouver. So some of it was just sort of editorial things, like you see there about ASCII diagrams. Others, were more substantial in sort of some additional clarity around, logging issues. Obviously, if you've got, sensitive data in a transaction token, you can't log the whole thing. You don't ever want to log something that's signed with the signature, so people could replay it, all those kinds of things. Let's go one more slide. I think it's got a easier version of the summary. So the subject token type, we added some work here. Largely the issue is if you have an internal workload that needs to request a transaction token, how does it provide the relevant information around subject, around like scope or purpose of the transaction, and those kinds of things to the transaction token service in order to get back the transaction token, and effectively, some thoughts around, who's allowed to make that request. We also added some security considerations that the entity requesting a transaction token needs to know that it's talking to the correct transaction token service. And then obviously the transaction token service has to authenticate the client making the request. So there's a mutual authentication piece there, but in an external context where you're getting an access token and wanting to pass it as the subject token type to the transaction token service, you don't want the client accidentally sending it to the wrong service, right? Because you've exposed the access token in that context. So some clarifications around and security considerations around that. Some updates around replacement transaction tokens and lifetimes. And like I said already, the logging and security and privacy constraints. Yes, perfect. So there's one other. We may cover two things on this slide, but one of the things we've been sort of talking about internally, and we wanted to get the feedback of the group, is there something that should be done around discovery? Is a transaction token service more like a mobile client doing certificate pinning, right, to an endpoint, and it's just the client should know who the transaction token service is, or is there some sort of discovery mechanism? Like, do we add, let's say, the transaction token service endpoint into the authorization server, or something like that? I think that for me is the bigger question. Whether there are aspects of the transaction token service that should be discoverable once you know where it is. I think it's it's an easier problem to solve, but would be interested if people have specifics around what those capabilities would be. So in the discovery, those were the things I wanted to get feedback on.
George, what would go into the discovery? Like, what information do you start with to discover something?
Well, so on the first one, like in the sense of discovering the transaction token service, that's a really good question. Hence, I'm bringing it up here, right? Like, I don't know how you would do that unless you bind it into some other document that is already known, and that gets to sort of a discussion that I put at the end, which has to do with deployment models. Probably, again, if I'd been a tad more prepared, I would have swapped the order. But I think that for me is the crux of the question, Hannes, is like, how would you even discover that? Or do we just basically say, right, it's a requirement of the deployed system, since transactions work within a single trust domain, that it's out of scope from a specification perspective as to how a client knows the correct endpoint for the transaction token service. And we just sort of punt on that and just say that's, within your domain, you configure it and you secure it, and it's just a security considerations, which is totally fine. But hence the conversation.
Yeah, I was like, before you brought this up, I thought that you would just define an endpoint at the authorization server, and of course you may have some extra metadata, like we defined metadata for the authorization server in general, you would also define metadata to be added for that purpose. But it seems that that was not cast in stone.
So yeah, and I see Aaron in the queue. The issue, I think, is that in a distributed environment, and again, this gets to deployment models. So maybe we should go have that discussion first. But if you were to say, I'm running in multiple VPCs in a geographically distributed way, right? Would your logical single transaction token service for your trust domain potentially have multiple endpoints? And you're supposed to talk to the one in your local environment.
Okay, I see Yaron in the queue. Yaron, do you want to speak up? Go for it, Yaron. Can't hear you. Still can't hear you. I guess Yaron is fiddling with his audio a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to the deployment models?
Sure. If you go, I think if you grab the second set of slides that I uploaded, which I think I labeled B2, and you go to slide 9, I'm guessing.
Let me have a look.
The last slide, I think, is where I added the.
Go for it.
Added the discussion about deployment models.
Schuster, George, the ability to find the correct transaction token server, do you imagine that for the initial exchange from access token to transaction token, like a gateway would do it? Or do you imagine it also for all the way within the trust domain to get a replacement transaction token, for example?
So I think, so I would say that there are 3 contexts in which transaction tokens can be requested right now, and maybe there's more, but there's 3 that I think we've sort of been talking about. One of them is that sort of edge transition, right? I'm at the edge and I want to get a transaction token for this transaction within my trust boundary. And so that thing, whatever that edge is, needs to know where the transaction token service is. And potentially an API gateway is a great way to do that. You also have internal workloads that want to start an internal sort of transaction that is not at an edge boundary. So the example we've used here is basically an inbound email server that may need a transaction token to deliver an email to an inbox, right, across all the set of things that happen when the email gets delivered. And there is no access token, there is no thing to it's kind of like an internal transaction token request. And then there's the replacement transaction tokens. I think each of those scenarios, the entity needs to know where the transaction token service is.
Yeah, what I'm thinking of is like the resource still needs to be able to like also know where the keys came from to validate those, right? And so maybe the question for me is like, do we actually need a discovery, or is it just more like configuration? Like as we would do it for authorization, right? You would just point it to the place to look at.
Yes, I think that is a critical question that we could just basically say from a security considerations perspective that it's part of the deployment mechanism, and the responsibility of those deploying the service to identify and ensure that entities know the correct location of the transaction token service, right? And there is no need for discovery in that context. If we do that, right, and there is metadata, as Hannes was talking about earlier, that's relatively easy to define, right? We can just say, okay, you query the the .well-known metadata file for the transaction token service from the URL that you got out of band, basically, right? And so I don't think that side of it is much of an issue. So deployment models, there is actually an issue here, and I would love to have people put their thoughts around deployment models. I've come up with 3, and like I said, not very prepared. 3 that I think are likely. One of them would be that the transaction token service is embedded in either the authorization server or the API gateway. And so, and either of those might be dependent on, sort of your performance and the kinds of workloads that you're processing. So sort of an embedded transaction token service is one model. Another would be like a single one, like truly centralized, not like single point of failure, but effectively logically single entity of a transaction token service that is still externalized from the authorization server or the API gateway or whatever, right? It's a service that stands on its own. And then I think there's sort of like what I'd mentioned earlier, a distributed set of transaction token services that form a logical single unit, but from a geodistribution perspective are running in geographically separated environments. And but I'm curious about other deployment models, specifically because right, does that create stress on the current specification? Are there use cases that need to be handled that have not yet been considered?
George, is that maybe a question we should ask in the Whimsy group? Because that's where some of the parties are that want to deploy that model, because it's very much related, right?
Yes, it is very much
I'm
related.
just wondering where we get some of the needed input to figure out whether those are the deployment models that people are looking at, or whether even some of those out of the 3, maybe there's one that people want to use predominantly. I don't know. Justin, what should we do? Then I ask Peter.
Justin Richer, co-chair of Whimsy. I don't know, come talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Whimsy working group is aware of the transaction tokens work. We keep reminding people about it. And it's already in our chair update slides for Thursday to remind people that transaction tokens is happening here and it's important related work. But yeah, I would raise this on the Whimsy list and try and gather some feedback on sort of the deployment and discovery models and how that might affect things like this. I think that it also might end up tying into some of the conversation about token translation and architecture and stuff like that. And I see Dean and Joe on the queue probably to say something along those lines, but it's I do think that a lot of the underlying models are going to be related. So I would raise this explicitly on the Whimsy list and say, hey, over in transaction tokens, we're trying to figure out what the right models to target for discovery look like, and this is what we thought. What else is there?
Sounds good. I can send a message to the list.
Dean Sachs. As usual, Justin stole my thunder. Yeah, this, George, as you know, is directly related to the work we're doing on token exchange and translation. Love to have the conversation there in Whimsy, certainly either on the mailing list or Slack as well. So please bring it there.
Bring it to the mailing list.
Yeah, I was about to say that Slack is, yeah.
Joe Salloway. Yes, just same thing that Dean and Justin said. And I think on the architecture doc side for Whimsy, we want to
I think, update and include some more information on transaction and context that we don't have in that spec currently. So I'd love to talk with you a little bit more about that and see how we can do it. Just one question on that third mechanism you mentioned. Would you see with this kind of distributed thing that all of those token services are equivalent, or are they kind of have different purposes? Thanks.
It's a great question. I think initially, so obviously open for feedback. Generally, I was thinking that they would be equivalent, right? That it's more of a performance mechanism to address the fact that, you know, you might need to be handling 100,000 TPS, right, coming through the system, and, you know, having to run across the Pacific Ocean to get to the transaction token service, you know, is just not going to be viable. And so in that context, right, having something local that can issue them would, you know, would sort of help solve that performance problem. It does create some distributions around authorization policy kinds of things, because at the end of the day, the transaction token service is performing some form of authorization. Should this particular client be able to get this kind of a transaction token? And so if they're distributed, right, you have the sort of distributed policy kinds of issues, but generally those are a little bit easier to solve in a performance scenario than you know, solving the latency of the high TPS requests. So generally I was thinking they would be equivalent services, just geographically distributed, therefore forming a logical whole. If they perform slightly different functions, then I think it create some interesting aspects of, is that multiple different transaction token services? Like the spec currently says that there is one logical transaction token service per trust domain. And would that hold true if they were doing slightly different things, I think is the question. And it very well may be. I have not thought about it.
Okay. George, which slide do you want me to
go the batch processing one.
Batch processing.
Should be one up.
It's on the screen.
Two up.
Can you see
from the end? Oh shoot! I just switched. Yes, I can see it. Sorry, lost my window. So this is largely coming from one of the issues that's in the that we have open yet that we haven't addressed, and the reason it becomes an interesting problem is because one of the core security principles of a transaction token is that it is very short-lived, right? Basically, just long enough to handle the processing of the transaction, and that's done for a couple of reasons. One, transaction tokens are bearer tokens, and two, you don't want to have to deal with revocation. I mean, part of the point is that in a multi-workload environment, we don't have atomic transactions, right? And so in revoking a transaction midstream is actually can create all sorts of other problematic issues in your back end. So the expectation is if the transaction token is authorized to start, right, then it's going to complete relatively quickly. And so you issue the transaction token to say, let this thing finish, right? And hence you don't need revocation. Batch processes are, you know, quite different, or, you know, maybe an EMR process that's running for, you know, 24 hours or something of that nature. And you know, what do you do in those sorts of mechanisms where you may need to potentially make API calls or invoke workloads throughout the course of the batch process, but it's sort of running autonomously, and so there's been a couple of different suggestions almost the kind of thing that what the transaction token service issues is not actually a transaction token, but a right to request transaction tokens for some period of time, so that the batch process can then go back to the transaction token service in an authorized way and say, hey, I need a transaction token right now to handle this one piece of my batch processing. Oh, I need another transaction token to handle this part of my batch processing, and something of that nature. But anyway, I think it's an important piece of work that should be part of the transaction tokens, sphere. And again, was looking for people, who might have thoughts in this regard. Obviously, happy to take any discussion on the issue in GitHub, but wanted to bring it up here because I think it's a sort of outstanding piece of work that we haven't really tackled yet.
Have you had a chance to look at the Kerberos sort of mechanism for dealing with these long-running batch shops? Because they ran into a similar issue. I don't remember quite how they resolved it, but I think it was also a special token with some indefinite renewal sort of mechanism.
I have not looked at that in depth. No.
I think we'll have to probably look it up. We'll probably have to look it up. You work there, so why not here as well? But Yaron, let's give it another try.
Yeah, can you hear me this time?
Now it works. Excellent.
Yep.
Thank you. I think this is even more of a whimsy question. It's very much in the context of how workloads are authenticated and authorized. So I would suggest to go to the whimsy list for this question. My personal opinion is let's not go through the slippery slope of having transaction tokens as access tokens. Let's keep them as context and therefore keep all of this out of scope of transaction tokens. But we need to have that discussion.
Okay.
And
Arndt Trinkschuster, +1 for your own to keep it out of scope. The problem I'm seeing with one token for the entire batch shop is the way I see transaction token is that you can safely forward them along the chain. And if you create one token for entire batch shop, it's like this allow star thing potentially. And if you send it along the chain, every workload along the chain could potentially impersonate that batch shop, right? And act on behalf of any user. And but it may potentially be a deployment choice, right?
No, I would agree with those concerns, and I probably, if I would lean in any direction, it would be more toward that special token. But I agree with what Yaron's saying, which is that it's weird for a transaction token service to issue something that's not really a transaction token, and I think that needs to be looked at super carefully. All right, I think we just have one more slide, and I'm probably giving some time back here. This came up at the last IETF, and this probably can be a very simple thing. But we basically agreed that, and I don't think we've quite done this yet, but we agreed that we would not call the sort of transaction context of the transaction itself AZD, because that's sort of overloaded with what RAR does. However, there was talk about embedding RAR in that context, and so I just wanted to sort of continue that conversation. It could be as simple as just saying that a RAR authorization details claim lives at the top level of the transaction token context claim, and we're done. I just wanted to bring it back up since we talked about it in the last meeting. And if there's no strong feelings, we'll just pick.
Justin.
Authorization details lives at the top level of the transaction token, and we're done.
I don't. Okay, so I'm all right. So I will ask the question: why at the top level?
Oh, it's
of,
wherever you said you were going to put it. Just now.
Okay.
I thought I was quoting you. But yeah,
right.
so it's. I think we should just reuse the claim, say where it most fits inside the transaction token, whether that's context or top level or something. I'm going to leave that to you editors to drop in the right spot. But the claim name and the internal syntax just pulls straight from RAR, because that's something that's really easy to reuse. And I think that the
Agreed.
additional stuff that transaction token defines for context is also valuable and probably talks about things that RAR isn't actually talking about. And so, yeah, having them sort of alongside each other in a way that semantically makes sense. I think that I agree. This is an easy place, an easy case of just pick somewhere fairly sensible to put it and just use the existing syntax.
But it only looks easy because RAR is more like a framework. You have to instantiate it somehow with some meaningful semantic, right? Like in the banking example, we have the semantic defines obviously by the banking people, but
we have the type field and all of that other stuff. Yes, absolutely.
Right. Someone
that's
has
going
to
be contextual.
like, who would that be?
Whoever is defining the API that's being called. Same people that define what a scope means.
Okay.
It's exactly the same question. And so just like we would want a transaction token to say, here's the list of scopes from an OAuth request that got applied to this in some fashion, we would want it to say, here's the list of RAR objects. It's effectively, it's a list of objects, and those objects have semantic meaning defined by the API, just the way scope string values have semantic meaning defined by the API. It's identical.
Right. And I think in the context of RAR and potentially transaction tokens, in many cases, I won't say in all cases, if the authorization request came with a RAR environment and the authorization server issued an access token in the context of some sort of RAR objects, right? And in some cases, those RAR objects are included in the access token, in which case they could just be copied into the transaction token. Right. So this, exactly how we do that, though, I think gets to sort of best practice. I mean, that's going to be true for a lot of things, right? I mean, we don't have good best practice documents on how you should use scope, or here are the 3 best ways to leverage scope, right? It's still just a space delimited, set of strings. And I think, similarly with RAR, right, there's experience that needs to be there, and then we need to sort of, figure out what are our industry best practices. And I think keeping that out of the spec makes sense, right? Because I don't think we want to try and codify that in a specification, at least at this point.
Well, to me, the question is like whether the RAR semantics or specification semantics gives the developers in these workload environments a rich enough sort of capability to do the sort of encode the authorization decisions, or whether they need to have something more flexible. Like we had a couple of IETFs ago, we had these even policy languages, which were obviously more powerful. We didn't do anything with it, but I don't know what that community wants, right?
So
we need to ask.
Justin Richard again, if I can respond to that, my take is that if there's a place that we can decide that policy languages fit inside the OAuth ecosystem, then we define a claim for it, we define a syntax for it, and transaction tokens can point to that too.
Fair enough.
Right. I think that they're all different ways to say similar things, and they give a different amount of power and flexibility and a different number of foot guns in each case. And so they're going to make sense in different places. I can see, so to extend George's example, I can see cases where you would actually not want to have the incoming RAR object issued to the transaction token, because the AS is saying, oh, this specific transaction is just this set of rights, whereas the incoming access token might actually be for something greater. Because I might have an access token that lets me like send email and download email and update my address book and all of this other stuff, but this transaction is send email to this particular or from this particular account. And if I want to be able to define that this is a set of access rights using RAR objects, there just needs to be a place to put it. And that's about what this boils down to.
Okay.
All right. I think that was the list of discussion topics. I don't know if anyone else has any other, and I'm not quite sure where we are on time.
We're out of on time.
Okay, so then we're done.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thanks, George.
My mark.
And you should move the microphone closer.
Very good. Hi, everyone. Another good morning. Now, unlike the previous presentations, I don't have an ID to present. I don't have a working group draft. My goal here is to figure out whether there should be one. So what I will be asking through the presentation periodically is if you have any comments, if you have any concerns, just let me know and we can hash it out. Now I'll get to my point then. Every now and then I kind of feel like I want to serve different AS metadata discovery depending on which client it is that is calling. And I'm going to talk about why.
On the next slide.
Thank you. Now this has to do with authorization server metadata discovery. So that's RFC 8414, otherwise also OpenID Connect discovery, with a few minor breaking changes in between those two. They're the same. As you can see, the request itself is quite simple. You make a get to a well-known endpoint, and you get back a set of registered metadata. There is no variance in this request. It's always the same, and there is no variance in the response. It's always the same because there is no indication in the request that could be the basis for serving a different response. Now, there shouldn't actually be a reason to send a different response in most cases, and I agree with that, but every now and then I do feel like it would be useful. Let's move on. As I mentioned, there's a lot of metadata that we can return, and in the past, we've been adding metadata very carefully. The registry keeps growing, and the shape of the metadata and the descriptions that we keep on adding, in some cases, it serves as a feature detection. So the language would be something along the lines of the server must indicate its support for, and in this case, it was the ISS parameter by setting the parameter in the response. And of course, because we want everything to be backwards compatible, we always say that if the parameter is omitted, the default should be something along the lines of it's not supported or false or some other default value that was used before. For example, I don't know, I can't come up with anything. Let's say that we only used SHA-256 for depop JKTs, and then all of a sudden we needed to add a new one. So let's say we would add a metadata for supported values and the default, otherwise if omitted would be just SHA-256. Right. So in an ideal scenario, we're adding everything in a non-breaking manner, and everything should be okay. However, metadata changes can break existing implementations and integrations. I do recognize that those are mostly related to bad client behaviors and bad client implementations. We know that those happen. It's inevitable. Nevertheless, I just want to point out a few that I've seen in the past. One of them being that an end session endpoint, which is the RP initiated logout endpoint of OpenID Connect, was added, and all of a sudden a client that was doing discovery after it was restarted started using that in its routine to log out the relying party. That's not a breaking change per se because the mechanism worked, but the customer was complaining because all of a sudden the user experience changed, because in OpenID Connect logout there is a possible prompt. and all of a sudden there was a 302 instead of just dropping a session and being done. The other that I've seen, and I think the slide there's a slight omission. So I've seen clients behaving differently depending on whether the authorization server changed the order of the array elements in code challenge methods and token endpoint out methods. So what I've seen personally, and it is scary, was a client not all of a sudden not doing authentication because the authorization server changed the order of client secret basic and none. All of a sudden client was not authenticating, which is scary because the authorization server should be able to change the discovery in a non-breaking manner without affecting the clients. Let's move on. The other thing that I wish that we could support with AS metadata is the idea of migrations or deprecations. So we've been with our respective solutions and authorization server implementations for quite some time. And every now and then I feel like I want to introduce a new endpoint. I want to do a new implementation of the endpoint. And it shouldn't mean a new discovery document. Now that is rather easy for the authorization endpoint because you can do a 302 or a 7 or one of the threes. But it's not so easy for any other endpoint that you make a post with a payload to. So this is what the current request looks like. And with the next slide, a slight change. A backwards compatible, hopefully, a client ID can provide a hint or any other structure that we would come up with. And all of a sudden, I can do a migration for that client to a new authorized endpoint, new token endpoint, and I can say, hey, for you, I'm able to serve the ISS parameter.
What's the value of the hint parameter? Is that the client ID?
Yes. It could be anything else that we come up with. So I'm not trying to replace or deprecate RFC 8414. This would be something that the client can opt into if it is being told to do so, because, for example, we are developing a new feature and we want the client to make use of it, but we don't want to make a change to a globally consumed endpoint just because one client wants to make use of a new feature. So my goal would be to allow gradual migrations, feature rollouts, and also because of the brittleness and inherent nature of changing a globally consumed endpoint, being able to opt out certain clients out of unnecessary changes. I realize that this does not apply to any existing client, but moving forward, this is something that I imagine clients could be using by default. I want to note that some servers already accommodate this discovery, and I know that because I tried to add client ID to all the different discovery endpoints that we have, and some of them started giving me errors with some very cryptic messages, such as not providing a valid client ID for that request. So that's about what I have. I want to hear your feedback, whether this is something worth pursuing or not. Either way, I'm okay with either. It's just something that, yeah, every now and then I wish I was able to make a client do something else based on the presence of a metadata.
Cool. Justin, you're first, Aaron afterwards.
Justin Richer. This seems like a great idea. Emphasis on seems. The one of the biggest lessons from the past that I think we can look to is the failure of WebFinger. WebFinger was something that I really, really, really wanted to be a real thing. One of the biggest issues with WebFinger, in my experience and in talking with a bunch of other folks who were trying to deploy it at the time, was trying to get a dynamic service up at the root domain of a system, which is the entire genesis of, or the entire basis of .well known. It's supposed to be at the origin, right? And so getting something dynamic up in that space is a very, very difficult thing in a lot of systems on a lot of domains. And so what WebFinger ended up doing in practice, the deployments that I was part of, was we ignored all of the parameters and always served back a static document of all the same things, which is what we already have today. So yes, I think it would be nice, and I think that it wouldn't hurt to define a way to do this, to say, if you see this parameter, then you're allowed to return something. All that said, I don't have high hopes for this actually really sticking in the system because of the constraints that tend to be around stuff that lives in .well known.
So what you're saying, it would be useful. However, the deployment often doesn't accommodate being able to use it.
Exactly.
That being said, it is not in the realm of, well, it is in the realm of possible that
Yes.
an authorization server could make use of it if the clients started sending its client ID.
Yes, absolutely. You also have the related issue of very strict path mapping to the static files, in that something with a question mark is just going to go to a 404, depending on how you've built the thing out. And so, yeah, I think that on the deployment side, there are just a lot of issues with making something like this actually work. Conceptually, though, I think it's solid. And I think it's not a bad idea. I think that there are some security and privacy considerations that would need to be hammered out with something
Privacy
like
for
this.
sure, yeah.
Absolutely. But yeah, conceptually, I don't see any problem with it. With deployment, though, I really do.
Is there a blocker to this ever, coming to fruition?
Oh, no,
Not
this
being able
working
to
group-
make use of a given mechanism just because of the deployment, to me, doesn't seem like we shouldn't be able to define it.
Oh, yeah, no, this working group defines all sorts of things that are bad ideas and don't get deployed. So let's go for it. And we've got a long and great history of that. I mean, so like, again, look at the history of Webfinger. It is an RFC. It was kind of deployed in a handful of places, and I still think it is a fabulous idea that I really wish would have taken off.
It looked promising.
It looked very promising. It solves a very, very key need that is still not really solved in another way today. But Dick says it's heavily used in ActivityPub. And so the thing is, though, we can still define it. We can't make people use it. And I think that it would be important, if we did take on this work, to go in with our eyes open about the problems of similar patterns in the past. We may not be able to avoid them. It might be better this time. I honestly can't say.
Thank you, Justin.
Hi, Aaron Baraki. I agree with most of what Justin says. I agree that the deployment issues around the top level domain can be very challenging. I think I brought that up in a number of other issues that we've talked about with other drafts here. That said, I know the scenarios in which you're talking about deploying this, and in those scenarios, the top level domain is under the complete control of the particular OAuth system anyway. So like it might be the case that this isn't going to be useful for a TLD domain and on the consumer public internet, but in a subdomain that's under the control of a particular customer, it's totally fine, right? So I think practically this would work for the types of scenarios you're talking about. And that brings me to the other point, which is as long as this is not required, then like it's probably fine. If this was like, this is how all AS discovery works forever in OAuth, then yeah, that's gonna be a problem. But since this is like kind of a upgrade for certain things, I think it would end up being fine. And then that shifting gears again, the other point you kind of mentioned, Justin, which is the privacy issues. This is a big topic in the FedCM discussions right now, where on the public internet, the idea of the authorization server and the client or IDP and RP, they should not know about each other until the user says, I want to connect. That kind of breaks this from working. So those are very much at odds with each other. But again, like it's probably fine because this isn't going to be used in those scenarios anyway. So actually, and even
I don't
so,
think FedCM is making use of our discovery endpoint.
no, but it could. It could if you.
It's a different protocol.
Yes, although I think actually there is actually there is an endpoint where the browser fetches client metadata from the IDP in FedCM anyway, but it happens without the cookie. So anyway, there's overlapping issues there. So but in general, I think this is a good idea, and I think it's useful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and keep it short. We are running out of time a little.
On transistor, I keep it super short.
I don't think we should do this to mitigate misbehaving clients, because it's not going to end, right, at some point, and then it adds a lot of chaos to the system if every client is going to behave differently based on the configuration. But I think it's a great way to try to really roll out changes on the authorization server, like changing token endpoint. You don't have this big blast and so
Two quick things. I dealt with the nightmare that Justin was talking about at AOL with trying to implement WebFinger for AOL and AIM, and it was horrific because I did not control those domains. I agree with Aaron's point that in this context, if we're talking about the authorization server, it often doesn't run on the ETLD plus, the ETLD of the domain, right? It probably is under a domain that's under the control of the dynamic service, so that may be easier. And I do think that there's opportunity here for some security principles. Like if it's your client, you may give a greater set of allowed metadata back than you would to a client that you don't know or that is third party. So I had done this very complicated thing between WebFinger and UMA so that you could sort of like authorize what data goes out to who way back in the day. I think some of those principles could come in if we allowed for this again in an optional way.
Mike Jones, I'll just observe that if you're using dynamic client registration, you have to hit the authorization server metadata to even learn where your registration endpoint is. So there's a chicken and an egg problem because you don't have a client ID yet.
I'm aware.
Descartes, why is this so low? There we go. Okay. I'll echo Justin's concerns around dynamic clients, having recently tried to go and build something that would, serve WebFinger for ActivityPub, and it was a frickin' nightmare to set it up. Dynamic responses aren't something that you're going to get hit with a heavy time. Like you want to use your CDN to be able to cache it and not be serving it out dynamically. Another potential approach on this, as opposed to query with a client ID, would be some extension to getting the metadata where you include a version and that it's not a query string, but it's like another piece of the URL that then could be cached. And so the client knows I want version 2 or I want version 3. And so you already have a custom client saying something. So there's a default metadata, but that would enable you to sort of version and change things.
And it wouldn't work with the actual discovery mechanism where you get the issuer identifier and you resolve the URL that you should be hitting, because the URL would change.
Let's
Well,
continue
no,
that
you would add
conversation.
another part to
We
the URL. Yeah.
already way over time.
We ran out of
It
time.
looks like we have good discussion here. Good. Thanks for starting. Thanks for starting
Thank
it.
you.
And we will continue our conversation at the next session, like the next hour session, I mean. And yeah, but it's too early to start the working group last call on the not yet existing document yet, I guess. So, but thanks. Yeah, thank you all for joining, and enjoy the lunch, and see you at the next session. Sorry for running over time.
Time this afternoon after the stack to talk about the